Namaste and welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here again today for the next chapter and episode of The Invitation, a veritable spiritual feast that it is as we read along. So we start today with chapter 8, which is episode 7. And the chapter title is Just Desserts. Waldo, Penelope, and Christo stroll casually down the stone path, circling gracefully around what in summer would be a circular lily pond filled with schools of fish, surrounded by chirping birds and croaking spring peepers. Then a slight breeze would bust them with its fragrance of late spring blooms. But now a chilling wind pulls them all together in a loving huddle so they can embrace the beauty of the full moon and sparkling star-filled sky for just a few moments longer. No one says a word, preferring to let the truth of nature nurture them. Finally, Waldo suggests it's probably a good idea to return to the house. There awaits our just desserts and a cozy, comfortable seat by the warming fireplace. And I say, probably the one I'd call my best friend. They quicken their pace and enter through the French doors that separate the large entertainment patio from the study. Waldo's exactly correct in his discernment. The warmth of the fireplace complements the softly playing Baroque music in the background, and the welcoming yet expansive book-lined study. Sitting in a high-backed Queen Anne chair next to the fireplace is the one Waldo has called his best friend. As they enter, he rises and steps over to greet Waldo with a warm hug and equally warm smile, saying only, "Ah, my dear friend." Waldo greets his friend in kind and then returns to Penelope and Christo as if to introduce them. "You must be Penelope and Christo," he says before Waldo can introduce the honorees. "How good to finally meet you. I'm Henry David Thoreau. Please call me Henry." "Namaste," they greet him in unison, then releasing a laugh at their eagerness. "Our reputation must have preceded us," says Christo with a smile. "Or our notoriety," one or the other, Penelope adds, laughing jokingly. "Oh, it definitely is your well-earned reputation," says Henry graciously. "You two exemplify so well what it means to lead by example. I've watched you carefully, and you're not afraid to step up to anyone with what rings true to you." Waldo adds quickly, "And to think that it can also apply to the rest of humanity," which it can, of course, albeit perhaps not in exactly the same form. "This is their daring and their genius all in one, Henry, and I agree that it is indeed admirable. I have long said," continues Henry, "that if you would convince a man that he does wrong, do right. But if you dare to convince him, but do not care to convince him, men will believe what they see. Let them see." "What about women?" Penelope asks, and then puts her hand over her mouth like a little girl would at the prospect of having spoken out of turn. Then she laughs to herself, saying, "I'm sorry, the devil made me do it," which of course only endures her all the more to the gathering. All laugh at her girlish ways and then return to conversation. "Devil or not, you are correct in letting such truth speak, Penelope," Waldo says in return. "You see, Henry and I were raised in a time when the masculine form was thought by most to be superior, even though we know better. It's just that our speech form may still retain some of the old affectations. But then my friend here needs no defense. His life speaks as the truth we all instinctively know." "Still," says Christo, "even though defense is unnecessary, it's nice to see a friend defend another. In the competitive world we see ourselves in today, this would be a rare event. And the strength of one who displays a strong sense of individuation is frowned upon. I am reminded of a circumstance early in my adult life when my superior, after attending a meeting together on a rather important agenda, called me into his office. "What's on your mind?" I asked innocently. He asked in return, "Do you always have to be yourself?" Needless to say, I was temporarily stunned by his query, but truth spoke out before I gave enough time for the ego to have its way. And who else would you want me to be? Well, he said, you could have been more political in this case. Yes, I rejoined respectively, but if I had been more political, then I would have served neither you nor the truth as well. I would have succumbed to the rule of the day, which was incorrect in this case. He never mentioned it again, nor complained again about me being only what I am. That's a good example of exactly what I mean by my earlier comment, Christo, and that's why we respect you both as we do. Thank you for your vote of confidence, returns Christo. Although Penelope needs no one to speak for her, I think it's fair to say that we both appreciate the privilege of your company and the honor of your affirmation. Right, Penelope? Since when have you asked me permission to speak for me? She responds, feigning a sassy attitude, endearing her to her company yet again. Isn't this the very thing we need to fortress, Waldo suggests, this firm rejection of outside authority? It contradicts that which we have come to know as truth. If we are to live with integrity of meaning intact, it seems to me that we might invest our energy first and foremost on learning what we are, divine, and then discerning the truth that comes from this essence of life. If not, we suffer at the pleasure of fools. Not that all others are fools, mind you. That's one's more superficial musings are foolish when compared with another's truth, carefully discerned. Does this not tie into the competitive spirit, Christo asks, that we should listen to outside authority rather than learning to listen and hear the truth that we are guided to know through the voice of consciousness, the Holy Spirit? It seems to me foolish to trust in some suggestion or command that comes from something other than my own experience. Wisdom would seem to include that my trust and faith had been better placed in, which comes from what I see life to be through the lenses of truth. Awareness is the key, it seems to me. Absolutely, Paula responds, and our purpose is to stay aware of the soul's own truth, and thus restore the perfection of self through its activation. Actually, I'd shift that thought some by saying that our purpose is to become aware of soul's truth, thus to know the meaning of truth as self, and then activating it through our individual demonstration or expressions of it. Uh-oh, Henry kids his friend. I can hear yet another treatise coming from this, and that is just fine, because you are in touch with so much that is divine, and aren't at all bashful about living it as the divine rings true to you. Now that, just like Penelope and Christo's regular demonstrations, is the example that leads others to the threshold of their own truth. Where's Khalil when we need him, asked Waldo. This would be a perfect time for his metaphysical treatment on learning. Oh, you mean when he speaks about leading others to the threshold of their own truth? Suggests Penelope. Then, without waiting for a response, she continues. That's one of our favorites. Christo and I use it often as a pillar of our teaching, which we think is a very high form of leadership, in order to stress the need to go within for the answers to all queries spiritual. As we like to say, go within and find only truth there. But if you instead trust me, it's akin to going west when you really want to go east. The only way you'll find what rings true to you is within, where the still, small voice of intuition speaks with indelible clarity. I will admit it's tempting to answer others' queries from the foundation of truth within me, but they will never learn to go within for themselves as long as I do it for them, as long as they let me put my head on their shoulders. Where'd you get that saying from, Christo asked. I don't recall using it in that form. I know, but we do say go to the threshold of your own truth, and then there to step over the threshold to what you know to be the truth on the other side. I just heard what else we should say from now on, so why not incorporate it? Sorry if I offended your sensibility. Of course you haven't offended my sensibility. I'm just curious, that's all. And I want to be sure we do incorporate that as well as any other new facets of truth we become aware of along the way. I'm so glad to have this validated by you two, says Waldo, because I think that a foolish consistency is a hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen, philosophers, and divines. With a consistency, a great soul has nothing to do. Speak what you think now in hard words, and tomorrow speak what tomorrow thinks is hard words again, though it may contradict everything you said today. Ah, so you shall be sure to be misunderstood. Is that so bad then to be misunderstood? Pythagoras was misunderstood, and Socrates, and Jesus, and Luther, and Newton, and every pure and wise spirit that ever took flesh. To be great is to be misunderstood. So, Penelope and Christo, I applaud you for demonstrating the power of your truth as you hear it. Dare to be misunderstood. Waldo finishes with the power of the truth he speaks. We don't have to worry about meeting that criterion, Christo says. Misunderstanding is the most frequent visitor. It occurs when we are fearful of looking inward to find what rings true to us, and thus understand that it will shift as conditions and one's ability to hear truth clearly change. A clear case in point is when I first began using the greeting Namaste. At first, I explained the meaning of this all-embracing gift as saying that I acknowledge the divinity in another. Then, as I inwardly heard more clearly the truth about that, I came to say that Namaste means, as a divine being, that I hereby acknowledge and celebrate your divinity. Once I came to know the truth about divinity, that all is nothing but divine, and that this doesn't mean that we had just a piece of divinity in us, then spiritual duty called me to modify my approach based on my new awareness. This way I have selected takes me on a course of fulfillment of purpose. At the same time, because I know both my divinity and thus my purpose, I come to respect the very same in all others. Thus I force them not to my view, but instead insist that they walk in their own. This is true in all relationships, let alone that of marriage or something similar. Many marriages are spoiled because one or both hold the other hostage for affirming the truth of their walk by also walking it with them. Yet this is precisely that which chokes the life out of relationships. Some partners give up their old friends and personal delights in order to please one another. Yet, in doing so, they give up that which nourishes in precisely the ways they need nourishment themselves. To make a very long story short, I couldn't read more with your thinking, gentlemen, that we must cultivate the acknowledgement and celebration of awareness, while at the same time, and for precisely the very same value, we must provide every ounce of support for all those around us to follow the same example. To me, based on its rightness for ourselves, this is the way we must treat all who come into our path. It is the highest priority of all. Living true to ourselves encourages others to live true to themselves. I'm so glad you returned us to the notion of priorities for a moment, declares Henry, so that we can focus on finding truth rather than succumbing to the numbing nature of man's folly. In our day, as in yours, most are engaged in business the greater part of their lives because the soul abhors a vacuum, and they have not discovered any continuous employment for man's nobler faculties. What we need to learn is that if you have built castles in the air, our work need not be lost. That is where they should be. Now put the foundations under them. In a way, our life is frittered away by detail. Simplify, simplify, simplify. So you see, even though most do fritter their lives away with unreasonable detail after detail, there is a purification that comes to life simply by understanding that there is another way. We all must be that example, the way of truth as life. If I may borrow a phrase from the Master Jesus, but said more in your words, Penelope and Christo, so that those who see might follow. I need a sip of water here. Thank you. Don't you think that fear plays an extraordinarily large role in keeping mankind stuck in the malaise that drowns so many Penelope urges? Fear keeps many in sour relationships and inappropriate jobs that no longer satisfy, if they ever did, and cripples the mind from the awareness of truth out of fear of ridicule from one's peers or family. Fear of lack keeps us from abundance. Fear of judgment keeps us tied to another's views of us. Fear of being either successful or unsuccessful keeps us bound to failure in either one. Worst of all, in my humble view, it is fear that keeps us tied mostly to our association with roles we play, and the external validation and affirmation that such roles command out of ego consciousness. We thus forbid ourselves to activate the truth of what we really are, and so fail in validating our awareness as perfection, uniquely individuated. That's a very elevated perception, Penelope, suggested Henry, and certainly one that needs to be shared. Once again, it is your example that brings such truth to light, lest it be hidden from spiritual view, with continuing ignorance its result. Your example is a lantern that enlightens, which beckons others to that same innate nature of truth discerned. Each of us has the innate need to expand. Soul requires it, for humankind largely mires itself in the quicksand of rational egoism, which only shrinks our sense of authenticity. We need to grow in understanding life. In that growth of self-awareness, we are validated and affirmed in our spiritual essence. This requires discernment, not judgment, for living true to ourselves is perfection in the eyes of those that can now truly see. Regarding the power of example of all who stand in the activation of their truth as example, it is this example that emboldens others to step out in obedience to what they inherently know to be the truth for them. This is what I mean that leadership is the art of seeing things invisible. When we stick to the art of looking within for our divinity and being inspired to discern what rings true to us, we are leading out of soul's command, and not just for that one, but for everyone. This is genius, true genius exemplified. Indeed, I know no more encouraging fact than the unquestioned ability of man to elevate his life by conscious endeavor. I dare anyone to question the perfection of the conscious awareness of truth and activating it for the good of one and all. This is the soul-expanding gift that is commanded of us by the power that expresses only highest good for us. In this way, we come to understand that it is never too late to give up our prejudices, those many errors of thought that have kept us in yesteryear, rather than living the truth that fills each day with ecstasy. And just what is this ecstasy? Henry inspires Waldo to ask. Is ecstasy some fancy word depicting one's feeling when she finds herself safely ensconced in her lover's arms? Is it the feeling we have when dining on elegant fare? Or is it simply that which we are able to discern and celebrate when we find ourselves enveloped by the truth that speaks within each of us? Ecstasy, it seems to me, is that moment or moments in which we become completely entranced by the beauty we find in the truth which speaks so profoundly and sweetly as our own, yet knowing in that very same moment that it also must ring as truth for all of us. Ecstasy thus comes through to the universe as a divine statement of genius, activated for our highest good, all of us. On the other hand, discontent is the want of self-reliance for the very reasons that we discussed earlier, because our soul commands it of us as beings of an ever-expanding nature. This is the nature about which I have spoken so much. Nature is none other than the totality of the environment that feeds and supports us all, and is a perfect metaphor for that never-ending, eternal, that is, expansion of creation. In truth, nature is but a mirror of our soul that commands the very same of us. The model or exemplar of nature thus reflects that nature in our own lives. The ever-expanding nature of divine creation, beginning with the fullness of beauty found only in the first cause, and deliciously expressed in all of its splendor throughout life. Thus, the inseparable nature of first cause and its effect is validated, as it must be, as only it can be. In this way, we can move the perspective of humankind from one that measures mankind's esteem by what each has, to the perception that mankind's dignity and esteem are found only in what each is. We can find the truth of that only by looking into the soul of mankind and validating it thus. The result? The result is an everlasting peace. Nothing can bring you peace but the triumph of principles. In this case, the case of life itself, the principles are narrowed down to a precious few, and each validating only truth activated as our way and life. This validates our activation as divine beings. Of this I am sure. Your use of metaphor as that which guides us to truth is a fascinating one, acknowledges Christo. Truth says to me that metaphor is the nature of our real, our spiritual understanding. For without its gifts to us, we would remain forever stuck in rational intellectualism, in the literal view of the imagery and melody that composes life for many. It is metaphor that releases the authentic meaning of truth from our midst, the poetic music of soul into the universe. In this spiritual opening, metaphor provides we are taken from intuition to insight and to enlightenment, which then take us even further to transcendence. And we are resurrected in order to live anew, inspired by the truth awareness brings to the fore. To think of metaphor as the midwife of perpetual spiritual reincarnation is a leap for most, but a no less powerful one. Of that I am certain. Metaphor is the truth of meaning found in the womb that carries the natural expression of truth within its walls. It is the ultimate light that erases the darkness of ignorance harbored in the time and space of ego consciousness. Yes, metaphor midwives truth into being, so that we are lifted from ignorance. Said more poetically, I suppose, we could say that the veil of ignorance is parted by the hand of metaphor. The real meaning carried in metaphor being the midwife that brings each successive consciousness child of truth into being. That sounds like self-perpetuating, unceasing prayer to me, Penelope claims. We'll move on to Chapter 9. I think we have time for it. Chapter 9 is Praying Unceasingly. Speaking of prayer, says Christo, I notice that neither of you spoke out about prayer from your perspective when we discussed prayer earlier. Well, responds Henry, we didn't want to divert anyone's attention from the views being expressed. Besides, our ideas on prayer are quite simple. Part of prayer is finding God in nature. This alone is a lifetime of prayer worthy of a saint. Knowing God is all, some would say God in all. What better source of connection could we have than the nature that supports the rest of divine nature? This is a marvelous connection between the worlds thought to be vastly different. Yet when one comes at such connections from this overriding perception of divine essence, then he transcends difference, reaching oneness of all that is. Isn't prayer also the way we work out soul's highest good into society? To my way of thinking, acknowledging the divine in the mundane, and exploring life from the reflections that inspire are forms of prayer, beautiful forms of prayer. Reading, too, can be thought of as prayer. Not primarily reading for information that one receives from any form of writing, let alone from so-called scripture itself, but rather, yet again, for the inspiration one receives from the written word. In that case, Penelope extends the viewpoint, wouldn't it also be prayer to include the conversations between people that engage and inspire deeper meaning in any and all who participate? I find that if I let go of my need to speak and instead listen deep within for resonance, then I am continually inspired, not only regarding the topic at hand, but equally so, how I am responding to the resonance I feel along the way. Inspired listening is one of those paths I like to think of as active meditation or active prayer. It is a gift of prayer worth emulating. When engaged in this way and for this purpose, the meanings that come forth are endless and most profound. I'd much rather pray by listening to try to impress what comes out of my mouth to God or anyone else. Thus, prayers being what we are, reflectively and respectfully, and using the resonance we have with what is said and done for our highest good, and for all the rest the same. I believe this is the genius of which you speak, Waldo. Well, you've done a lovely and accurate job of describing just that, Penelope, responds Waldo. In a sense, what you're saying is that mankind limits his view of prayer needlessly. By doing so, he shuts himself off from the largeness of God's offerings. Unfortunately, this also minimizes himself as a divine being. After all, it is the largeness of God as spiritual consciousness that provides the spaciousness to cast all as divine. Without this spaciousness, divinity is severely limited, and such diminishment only shrinks our being in our own as well as others' view of us. This is exactly the opposite of the characterization of attribute man is to manifest. We are expansive in our nature, just as all of nature shows us when we take the time to learn from what it has to teach us. Prayer is thought by man to be a way of gaining special favor. Prayer looks abroad and asks for some foreign addition to come through some foreign virtue and loses itself in endless mazes of natural and supernatural and mediatorial and miraculous. Prayer that craves a particular commodity, anything less than all good, is vicious. Prayer is a contemplation of the facts of life from the highest point of view. It is a soliloquy of a beholding and jubilant soul. It is the Spirit of God pronouncing the works of good. But prayer is a means to effect a private end is meanness and theft. It supposes dualism and not unity in nature and consciousness. As soon as man is one with God, he will not beg any longer. He will then see prayer in all action. Thus man's prayers become a disease of the will, wanting favor for their private gain. Thus also all their creeds of disease of the intellect. Everywhere I am hindered of meeting God and my brother because he has shut his own temple doors and recites fables merely of his brothers or his brother's brother's God. And so we are deprived of that one voice within each that informs only with truth. In this way, such ideas and minds become the idols we worship. We become slaves to them, instead of dedicating ourselves to the indomitable character of wisdom we find only within our own divinity. Familiar as the voice of mine is to each, the highest merit we ascribe to Moses, Plato, and Milton is that they sat at not books and traditions, and spoke not of men, but what they thought. A man should learn to detect and watch the gleam of light that flashes across his mind from within, more than the luster of the firmament of bards and sages. Yet he dismisses without notice his thought, because it is his. In every work of genius we recognize our own rejected thoughts. They come back to us with a certain alienated majesty. Is this not the failing of mankind, that we have succumbed to views proffered by others to our own demise? Need a little sip of water again here. Thank you. That's so true, says Penelope. That's why we use Jesus' words in order to inspire in us what informs only his truth. Jesus says that we are to go within so as to find God, that is, discern what rings true to us. We call that truth. This is what gives life to and what activates the loving way. How could something harbored in someone else's thoughts, especially if they are garnered from the seed of abject ego-conscious stimulus, be right for us? In all likelihood, such renderings are not even right for those who harbor them, let alone as they project them onto us. It has been our treatise since the beginning that when we give our lives to the hollow declarations of outside authority, The only result must be just as hollow. Cause and its effect are inseparable after all. Yet when we follow our inner authority, that cause, those truths we find only within, then the inseparable effects that are sure to follow validate only the truth of divine personification. As God's law of first cause, this is all that can happen in the world of cause and effect. I think it would be good to clarify what you mean by self-reliance, suggests Christo wisely, because the impression people could gain from this terminology would most likely be the rugged individualism some would classify as egoistic and selfish in nature. That's why when we speak of this necessary principle of being, we always stress its spelling as capital S on self-reliance, which connotes the divinity of self, the God we find within, the God we are, delivered as us, expressed as a divine self. It's somewhat of an affectation, we know, but it does seem to help. Well, now that you say that, says Waldo, it's obvious that we do indeed mean the same thing. So by all means, let's correct any potential for misunderstanding right here and right now. I have this to say to that, and it is my single admonishment to one and all. Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. Accept the place the divine providence has found for you, the society of your contemporaries, the connection of events. Great men have always done so and confided themselves childlike to the genius of their age, betrayed their perception that the absolutely trustworthy was seated at their heart, working through their hands, predominating in all their being. And we are now men and must accept in the highest mind the same transcendent destiny, and not minors or invalids in some protected corner, not cowards fleeing before a revolution, but guides, redeemers, and benefactors, obeying the mighty effort in advancing on chaos and the dark. I frankly don't know much stronger or clearer I can say what I mean by the need to be self-reliant, or as you two say it, self-reliant with a capital S on self. I like your emphasis, even though I suspect that some pain is inflicted on you for such use of language. I commend you, however, both for your boldness of service and for the shield you place around yourself by walking in your own truth. Deliverance and not deciphering is your purpose and the way for you, and it fits you both very well indeed. I couldn't agree with you more, Waldo, affirms Henry. These two have been and will continue to be, I strongly suspect, dedicated to the awareness and expression only of the truth each finds within. This dedication bodes well for the future, not only their future, but also the future for those that they will lead by their example. My own view is similar to theirs and yours, Waldo, in that public opinion is a weak tyrant compared to our own private opinion, actually our private truth. What a man thinks of himself, that is which determines, or rather indicates, his fate. I know we have heard Penelope and Christo speak of obeying their muses, the voices to which they give obedience. They even put an uppercase M on muse to heighten the attention to the sacred nature of muses, and to that I say, hooray! More need to be made aware of such matters of inference and inspiration, lest the world fall to the vacuous nature of illusions perpetrated and perpetuated into life, falsifying the nature of illusions, thought by many to be both the truth as real. And yet we know that illusions are untrue, not real, posits Penelope, even as we abide in them. We've become so domesticated in the container of dualistic belief and prescription that we have lost contact with the truth of our being. What troubles me most, I suppose, is that many of our churches lodge doctrine and dogma in the minds of their followers, which does nothing to dispel such untruths. In fact, it's quite the contrary. They separate God, and in this case Christianity, Jesus, from all the rest of the world, and thus foist upon us all the guilt and shame that separation contains. They thus also foist on us the added burden of punishment, self or otherwise, that guilt commands. Of course, if we don't want the punishment or pain inflicted on us, we will do all we can to avoid it. So we do precisely by projecting it onto others in one way or another, and by inflicting it on ourselves most unwittingly, yet blaming it all on someone else, rather than holding ourselves accountable for the false view that propelled it into space in the first place. The law of cause and effect has never been more inaccurately and ineptly applied. This is a good reminder to stick to what we find within instead of without, Penelope. Although I wouldn't necessarily have used that point for this purpose, it works here and now, Henry says, so you might as well hear it. A man is rich in proportion to the number of things he can afford to let alone. By this I mean the more we can shut off from the outside, its influences on what we know to be the truth we find within, the better off we'll be. Such outside influences come at us only as distractions, like the mosquitoes that bite us in the dark of night, that are nourished by the blood they drain from us, but as such, and ugly intrusions, they nourish us not. To me, inserts Christo, this speaks to the Adam and Eve story. And that's a pretty long leap, isn't it? Declares Penelope. No, I don't think so. Waldo comes to Christo's defense. Let's at least hear how this comes to be in his mind. Thanks for the opportunity, Christo says with gratitude. Let's see, where to begin? Well, let's just say that this story is all about distraction from the truth God is. God tells Adam and Eve to eat of the trees of good, but not from the one that could easily be have been labeled evil, as has been called for ages. The serpent in this case, the representative character of evil and error, convinces Eve to eat of the tree of evil, which in the larger picture only means a tree that bears fruit that will distract you from the only truth there is, divine consciousness. That is found only within and not on the trees of erroneous thought found without. Such trees bear only fruit of fancy, that is, those fanciful ideas that are thought to be true, but are only illusions created out of the superficiality of the ego striving for equality with God. If I may add gratuitously here, the difficulty with a domesticated approach to living is that by believing in the way of ego consciousness, we are perpetuating a falsehood that illusion is real and has truth embedded in its nature. And it's exactly the opposite that is true. The ego consciousness way is false and untrue, and thus unreal. Anyhow, the serpent serves to somehow warrant attachment to illusion, the mortal mind configuration that only drains our energy and begs for our allegiance, so it can distract us from our truth of being. So the story of Adam and Eve is tantamount to an allegory that teaches us that when we bow to serving both God and mammon, both God and the vehicles of intellectualism and rationality portrayed through the ego, then we are bound to and plagued by the multivarious streams of distraction that are sure to follow. So, in a phrase, the wiser advice is to give them no thought, or to nothingize them, and return only to the source of truth you can find as reality. As we learn to speak and demonstrate only what rings true to us, we personify the consciousness through all we are and do. This, it seems to me, is our purpose and example all in one, and expressed as one. So, Penelope, do you still think this is a stretch? Asked Waldo. No, never did think so, really. I just wanted to be sure Christo gave us the fullness of his wisdom in the matter. I was afraid that its mere mention of potential would have ruled the moment. We play off one another like that sometimes, Christo confesses, just as I suspect you and Henry do, Waldo. To be sure, Waldo agrees. Make no mistake about it. We feel perfectly comfortable letting one truth follow the other. We share even opposing views so as to penetrate the veils of illusion that keep others from delving into their own truth. We don't need to intrude on others, but I do think we have some responsibility to express truth as a living example for others to follow. I don't mean by that they need to follow any truth we may put into the universe, but that they could well do the very same should they see this way as beneficial to them. In the end, it's all about inspiration. I'm sure we all would agree on that point. How does this all play out in the hands of equality for all, Penelope asked. That's a very good question, Penelope, responds Waldo, and completely worthy of response. As a nation, I believe that we will walk with our own feet, we will work with our own hands, we will speak our own minds. A nation of men who for the first time exists because each believes himself inspired by the divine soul which also inspires all men. Now this being so, if we believe that at the level of soul all beings have access to divine inspiration and seek and love freedom and knowledge and truth, then it must be on this highest level of being that we are equal. Therefore, we must treat one another as equals. In this way, we continue to fight for the freedom of all, with no preference to color or gender or any other form of what could separate us one from the other. What a wonderful testimony to the truth of the atonement that makes us free, Penelope honors those affirmations of truth. I'm suspect, however, that as a society we still haven't come full swing into deliverance of the obvious. I suppose it's only because so many still live and act under the influence of that which intoxicates. The ego-consciousness form of illusion that spirits them into its malaise, as thick as the quagmire that has kept us apart for centuries. What we need instead is to get drunk on the best of those spirits, the truth that speaks to us as the voice of consciousness. It's only when we can not only acknowledge this for ourselves, but also for our brothers and sisters, yes, and even for the environment that supports us all, that we will hold all as equal, deserving our full respect for the dignity of all forms of life. When we come to that point, we will begin with respecting our own divinity, and then by that very acknowledgement, respect the dignity in one and all alike. Then we will celebrate all as one and treat each other the same, lovingly. It's a long stretch, but I do believe we can do it. However, in order to do so, we need to help more serve as exemplars of truth inwardly discerned. While it is well and good to see the teachings of Jesus in another light, one that burns brightly and the purifying flames of insight gained through the metaphorical application of life, we must learn to mediate all of life in this way and, by example, attract others to the fore. It won't do to just deal with those who call themselves Christians, for all religions contain mediations that reflect unjustly on the truths they contain. It is by exposing more and more to wider and wider ranges of spiritual understanding that mankind can finally come to walk truth as the way that is life. That is a marvelously crafted design on leadership, Henry affirms, and one that merits strong consideration, widely so. It seems to me that the world could benefit from the teachings of the masters, much like what has transpired this evening. We all can learn from the sages that have transcended the ego-conscious journey in order to arrive home at the truth for them. We all resonate with such truth when we are exposed to it, no matter where we find it or what we learn from it. Truth speaks with indelible clarity. The real difficulty, just as it was in our time, is that people are way too busy to serve their greatest need, that being the cultivation of soul. You don't mean by that we must reshape soul to fit our need, do you? Asked Penelope. It seems to me the cultivation of the soul might better mean the stirring up of the soul around it, so light can find its way out from it into our everyday realm of being. If that were not so, we would be committing to a belief that says we must work hard to get somewhere. That somewhere being good enough, so we could then be validated as authentic presence in God's company. I'm sure you don't mean that, Henry, do you? You're quite right, Penelope. That's not what I meant at all. What I'm speaking about here is expansion. When we cultivate something, anything, we are giving to expansion of its being in us. We are saying the very same thing. Cultivation is about expanding our capability and capacity for reflecting the truth that already reigns within, found in our own divinity. Yet that is inextricably linked with the divinity of all. This greater spiritual discernment must be brought to light that we already are and not shall be perfect and immortal. Thus there is nothing to strive for, only what needs to be uncovered and discovered as the ultimate truth. What could be nobler than this commitment to one another? Indeed, what could be nobler than this? As far as humankind is concerned, Penelope re-engages Henry, I know of nothing nobler for one to walk toward truth and thus honor the same walk in all others. In this way we hold ourselves faithful to and are impeccable with our word, the Logos, the truth for us that also enriches the rest of society. As we walk our talk, we embolden and inspire others to walk in the awareness that forms the way for them, as well as all those they will come in touch with. Perhaps this is a kind of recruitment that will fuel the fires of enthusiasm for running our very nature as divine. Bottom line, I remain hopeful. Doing it, rendering your life thus eradicates the need for hope, does it not? Christo asks. Walking our talk, our truth as the healing word, places truth in the foreground of reality and renders hope imperfect as the expression of the loving way. We don't need hope when we are walking in truth. Walking in truth is the reality that hope once wanted or dreamed of, and which is now in the fullness of its awareness and expression fell from its dream stage. We must transcend the dream if we are to ever achieve the fullness of our capacity to love. After all, Penelope, as you and Henry were leading to us to understand only moments ago, life's not about becoming something. Life's about acknowledging and activating our divinity from the truth of what we already are. Every demonstration of the loving way validates the essence of life. It validates our divinity at every turn. I sure like the idea that life validates our divinity at every turn, Waldo asserts. That might do well as an inspirational phrase for this new movement you're speaking about, Christo. I know you haven't put it quite this way until now, but that will surely fuel the fires for a movement in this direction. As far as I am concerned, Christo says in return, the world could well benefit from the exploration of the wisdom you two and others like you have brought to us over the years. I'm not suggesting this as a movement based solely on transcendentalism, although such a thing would be a remarkable improvement on what we now use as our basis for living a fruitful life. What I am proposing, however, is some kind of movement based on the spiritual discernment available within everyone, and its activation as the loving way, the loving way. Thus the movement becomes about the principles of truth and the ways in which our divine inspirations can serve the greater good. You better be careful about that one, says Baldo with tongue-in-cheek. Someone has already done that and was crucified for it. Seems to me that it's not about crucifixion, Christo rejoins, or the fear that comes to the surface when one is considering such a path. It's only about being obedient to the truth we are called to serve. Perhaps that is the understanding that needs to be inculcated far and wide. As you know so well, I am all for it, and so is Henry, Rubble says. Go for it. Go to it. It's your turn now. No, it's not just my turn. It's all of us that will march together by any inspiration we bring to bear on such callings, continuing to motivate those who will come to hear and see what heretofore was unavailable to them. When more aware, the teaching of those who have inspired through the ages will once again come to the fore. Just so you know, Waldo and Henry, when I mentioned recently that I was studying your works, the one I told swooned in ecstasy at the thought of doing so. The same rings as truth from all those we've spoken to since we arrived. So I can see that anything I share with my friend about this affair we celebrate together this evening will be intoxicating to her. Indeed, her spirits will sail to the heavens above. Within, you mean, Penelope corrects Christo with aplomb. Yeah, whatever, Christo says ironically, letting Penelope know that he appreciates this seemingly minor correction, while knowing that it is major indeed. Well, here we are, now facing Chapter 10. It's a pretty long reading today, but we'll do Chapter 10 in the next episode, a week from now, beginning a week from now. I'll close now with this little thing I spotted during the week. As a writer, you try to listen to what others aren't saying and write about the silence. That was posited by an N.R. Hart, H-A-R-T. As a writer, you try to listen to what others aren't saying and write about that silence. That's a wonderful expression, really, just wonderful. Well, okay then. I hope you have a great week between now and next week. I hope you stay well and happy. I hope that you are practicing being the only thing you are, love, with all that you engage with day by day, moment by moment. So then, my friends, namaste. I love you.